Welcome to our Scarlet Letter project by Amber Sook, Sarah Rhee, Sharyse Watanabe, and Yoojin Kim. Period 1 of Miss Pelletier's AP Language and Composition class.
Today, we will be discussing utilitarianism and applying it to the characters Hester Prynne and Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale from the novel The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. What constitutes moral worth? According to Jeremy Bentham, it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. In utilitarianism, the morality of an action depends on the consequences and not the intentions. John Stuart Mill agreed with Jeremy Bentham on his theory of utility for each person, but he also believed that there were higher and lower pleasures. Mill states that a higher pleasure is a pleasure of their intellect, while a lower pleasure is a physical pleasure. As Mill states in his essay Utilitarianism, a being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, and certainly accessible to it at more points, than one of an inferior type. But in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence. He explains that once people are exposed to higher pleasures, they would rather have these higher pleasures than the lower pleasures. The higher pleasures give more moral worth to an action than a lower pleasure would, because the quality of an intellectual pleasure brings more pleasure than a physical pleasure. In the Scarlet Letter, because Puritan society values conformity and obedience, although an action may be moral because it furthers the goals of the society, which is to maintain obedience and uniformity, the action is a lower pleasure because it keeps the society from achieving a higher pleasure, such as the freedom to express themselves. We will now examine the consequences of Hester and Dimmesdale's actions and see whether or not the actions benefit society, and if so, to what extent. Is morality subject to change within a person? Yes, morality is subject to change within a person because there is no absolute right or wrong in utilitarianism. The society's view is important because if their view changes, then the morality of an action or person changes with it. There cannot be an absolute standard of pain or pleasure for everyone, as definitions of pain and pleasure will differ for every individual. Utilitarianism focuses on the consequences of an action, and because morality is based on the consequences that benefit or harm the society, it is the society that judges the morality of an action. How does intent and or consequence of individual actions affect morality? The intent does not matter in utilitarianism due to the fact that utilitarianism is from a consequentialist point of view. Therefore, only the results of an action have an effect on the morality of the person. An action is judged as more moral when more people are brought pleasure or happiness from that action. Higher and lower pleasures are also taken into account when happiness is given to society. So in conclusion, it is the consequences and not the intentions that determine the moral worth of the person from a utilitarianist point of view.
Our graph of utilitarianism is of the first 15 chapters of the Scarlet Letter, describing the moral worth of our two characters, Hester and Dimmesdale. Hester's morality will be represented by the orange plot points and lines, while Dimmesdale's morality will be displayed by the blue lines and points. Our x-axis measures the passage of time in the book by chapter number. On the y-axis, the moral worth of the characters is quantified into most of society, individuals, and the individual. A negative on the y-axis is when an action is immoral and lowers the moral worth of the character due to a certain action. The positive y-axis is the number of people that are either helped or brought pleasure from the action. However, we must take into account the higher and lower pleasures that were described by John Stuart Mill. So, for each positive y value, there is one for higher pleasure and one for lower pleasure. We do not need to have the higher and lower pleasures for the negative y values, because there is no pleasure involved in those actions. The y-axis also never reaches all of society, because when we analyze the benefits, we take into account the actor of the action, and because all of our highest benefits require the sacrifice of an individual, an action can never benefit everyone in society.
We will begin by analyzing Hester and her plot points. When Hester commits adultery before the story begins, she is giving pain and distress to Chillingworth, Dimmesdale, Pearl, and herself. Although her actions may have provided herself and Dimmesdale pleasure in the short term, it ultimately sets a path of extreme guilt and pain to them both. Dimmesdale eventually dies of terrible guilt and psychological torture from Roger Chillingworth. This can be seen when the author mentions that Dimmesdale was suffering under bodily disease and gnawed and tortured by some black trouble of the soul and given over to the machinations of his deadliest enemy. Page 123. Hester's actions also give Pearl an identity as a product of her sin, which leads to Pearl receiving scorn from others and suffering from the punishment of her mother's sin. This can be seen when Pearl is described as a born outcast of the infantile world, an imp of evil, emblem, and the Scarlet Letter product of sin. She had no right among Christian infants. Page 84. As for Chillingworth, when Hester commits adultery, she is betraying him and essentially dooming him to a life based on his desire for revenge. If Hester had not committed adultery, Chillingworth never would have been seen as having something ugly and evil in his face, page 112, by the townspeople, which demonstrates his vengeful intentions. Hester also harms herself because, with this sin, she is exiled from society and has to live with the knowledge that she has harmed those who are closest to her. Therefore, because Hester begins by harming these specific people, she starts off below the y-axis with low morality.
In Chapter 2 of the book, when Hester is publicly punished for committing adultery, the townspeople gather around to watch her as if she is a form of entertainment. We can see this in the statement, "It was safely to be inferred that the infliction of a legal sentence would have an earnest and effectual meaning," on page 53. Hester's public punishment reinforces the goal of society to ensure conformity and obedience from its people. Hester's punishment intimidates others from sinning and acting out against society's rules. Therefore, she is benefiting society. Hester's benefit to society is a lower pleasure, though, because the message that she is supporting suppresses their freedom of expression. Also, because these townspeople are having fun by mocking and criticizing Hester, their pleasure is considered to be a lower pleasure rather than a higher pleasure. For example, Hawthorne writes that the scene was not without a mixture of awe, such as must always invest the spectacle of guilt and shame in a fellow creature before society shall have grown corrupt enough to smile instead of shuddering at it. Page 53. These townspeople are driven by their passion rather than their practicality, and their morality is twisted because it sees the degradation of human dignity as moral. Also, Hester's public punishment is not considered to be entirely moral because Hester is sacrificing herself and suffers humiliation and shame.
When Hester withholds the name of her child's father in Chapter 3, she is immoral because she is not allowing justice to be served in the Puritan society. For example, she says, "I will not speak, and my child must seek a heavenly father, she shall never know an earthly one." Page 63. By hiding the father's identity, Hester is preventing the society from being able to enforce its message of obedience, and instead, Hester is defying society by getting away with her sin. Also, by withholding Dimmesdale's identity, in that moment, Dimmesdale feels relieved that he is not caught, but ultimately his hidden guilt leads to more suffering and eventually to his death.
In Chapter 8, Hester's decision to keep Pearl when Hester protests, "She is my happiness. She is my torture nonetheless. Pearl keeps me here in life. Pearl punishes me too. See ye not, she is the Scarlet Letter, only capable of being loved, and so endowed with a millionfold the power of retribution for my sin? "You shall not take her. I will die first," on page 100, is immoral. Hester only benefits herself and Pearl, but prevents society from raising Pearl to become a productive member of Puritan society. Hester benefits because Pearl keeps Hester from falling into deeper sin. And Pearl receives pleasure because she receives the higher pleasure of being able to be an individual, and eventually she is able to escape Puritan society. On the other hand, if Hester had given Pearl up, then Pearl had the possibility of being able to become a member of society who contributed to their productivity and goal of uniformity. Governor Bellingham argues this when he states, "My poor woman," said the not unkind old minister, "the child shall be well cared for, far better than thou canst do it." Although there is no guarantee that Pearl would have become a member of society, in the end of the novel she disappears and escapes from Puritan society, which guarantees that Pearl does not benefit their society at all. Because utilitarianism is the maximization of pleasure, any action that prevents maximization of pleasure is immoral. Hester is immoral because by keeping Pearl, she ensures that society receives no benefit from Pearl as a member of their society. And because Hester is also keeping most of society from receiving the pleasure of Pearl as a productive member of their society, Hester's plot point is below near most of society. The plot point is not as low as Hester's immoral action of withholding Dimmesdale's name as Pearl's father, though, because although Pearl would have benefited society, she would not have benefited as many people as the number of people that were given an immoral example from the withholding of Dimmesdale's name.
In Chapter 12, when Dimmesdale asks Hester about the mysterious man, Chillingworth, he says, "Who is that man, Hester?" Page 137. And although she knew the answer to his question, she remembered her oath and was silent. Page 137. Hester is harmed in this situation due to her sense of guilt, because she believes that she has a duty to Dimmesdale to protect and help him. Hawthorne describes Dimmesdale's suffering from this incident as, "Never did mortal suffer what this man had suffered. He fancied himself given over to a fiend, to be tortured with frightful dreams and desperate thoughts, the sting of remorse, and the despair of pardon."
Second, we will be analyzing Dimmesdale and his plot points. Dimmesdale's actions before the story begins also hurts the same people as the people Hester hurt. Hester, Pearl, Chillingworth, and himself. When Dimmesdale commits adultery, he ends up hurting himself the most because private shame is greater than public shame. In the Scarlet Letter, Dimmesdale suffers from the tremendous guilt of hiding his sin and suffering from his private shame. This can be shown as the author states that Dimmesdale was suffering under bodily disease and gnawed and tortured by some black trouble of the soul, and given over to the machinations of his deadliest enemy. Page 123. From the very beginning, Dimmesdale starts to deteriorate because of his torturous guilt. As for Pearl, Dimmesdale takes away her chance of being a normal Puritan child because her origin of sin deems her a sinner from birth. Dimmesdale harms Chillingworth by keeping his identity hidden because Chillingworth's ignorance of the identity of Pearl's father obsessively drives Chillingworth to seek revenge. Dimmesdale also harms Hester with his silence, which leads to Hester having to bear the entirety of the burden throughout the trial and later during the public punishment. Dimmesdale's actions at this point in the story are equally as immoral as Hester's in Chapter 3. He praises her for withholding the name of her accomplice when he states, "Wondrous strength and generosity of a human's heart, she will not speak," page 63, and does not confess his sin. His cowardice keeps him in the dark as he hides his sin from the rest of society. As a pastor, his actions are hypocritical because his actions contradict his teachings of morality. In other words, his responsibility is to maintain order and obedience in society. However, his actions and silence significantly jeopardize this goal. Therefore, his actions do not uphold the goals of the society and are therefore considered immoral. This plot point is lower than the punishment for committing adultery because it harms the justice system that the society has created. In Chapter 8, when Dimsdale supports Hester's decision to keep Pearl, he says, "Truth in what Hester says, and in the feeling which inspires her. God gave her the child and gave her, too, an instinctive knowledge of its nature and requirements." Page 101. He commits the same immoral action as Hester of preventing society from benefiting from Pearl, therefore his action is considered immoral. Although it cannot be guaranteed that Pearl will have a positive impact on the society, Dimsdale is taking away even the slightest possibility of Pearl's contribution to society. Dimsdale is harmed by this action as well because, although he may be able to relieve some of his guilt for not confessing to his sin, seeing Pearl will always remind him of his sin, and Dimsdale will always be harmed by Pearl until he confesses to his sin and relieves himself of self-shame.
In Chapter 11, Dimsdale's sin finally has a positive outcome. Since Dimsdale is a sinner himself, this very burden it was that gave him sympathies so intimate with their sinful brotherhood of mankind, so that his heart vibrated in unison with theirs and received their pain into itself, and sent its own throb of pain through 1,000 other hearts, in gushes of sad, persuasive eloquence. Page 124 to 125. Because Dimsdale can now empathize with the citizens and can save more of them, Dimsdale benefits most of society. Dimsdale, however, does not benefit everyone in society because the source of his improved preaching is his own agony.
As we begin to analyze the graph as a whole, we will be looking at the overlaps in the moralities of Hester and Dimsdale. First, Dimsdale and Hester start off with the same moral value because they both commit adultery, which is considered immoral. However, the plotted dot is not at the very bottom of the y-axis because Hester and Dimsdale's actions were private sins and immediately affected themselves, Pearl, and Chillingworth. Their sinful action did not harm any of the townspeople directly. We see Hester's morality increases while Dimsdale's decreases. This is due to the fact that Dimsdale keeps his sin a secret. By keeping his sin a secret and not admitting, Dimsdale is going against what Puritan society believes is just. On the other hand, Hester was out in the open during her public punishment in Chapter 2, becoming an example for the rest of the Puritans. Her utility increased, while Dimsdale did nothing to benefit the society and harmed them by defying Puritan principles. However, their moralities meet again in Chapter 3, when Dimsdale refuses to confess his sin and Hester refuses to reveal the identity of her accomplice. They are both equally guilty of depriving society of conveying the need to conform. In Chapter 8, they both increase their morality as Hester tries to keep Pearl and Dimsdale stands up for Hester. But it does not become positive. Both Dimsdale's point and Hester's are equal because both are essentially taking away another possible productive member of society, thereby hindering the advancement of the society as a whole. From Chapters 3 to 8, Hester's and Dimsdale's morality increase as they both act more to conform to society. Dimsdale's moral worth dramatically increases up to higher pleasure for most of society because from that point he becomes a better minister and helps the townspeople improve themselves as better people, even though he suffers more internally. Dimsdale is able to relate to the sinners, therefore he is able to bring more of them to salvation. Unlike Hester's actions before, where she gave lower pleasure to society, Dimsdale gives society the higher pleasure of salvation and giving them the example of true repentance. Hester's morality also increases from this point on, but does not bring her moral worth above the x-axis, keeping her in the negative due to her decision to not tell Dimsdale of Chillingworth's true identity and intentions. Even though Hester and Dimsdale's moral worth begin in the same place, their end moralities are opposites. Through the course of the first 15 chapters, Hester's morality shifts up and down as she struggles to find her place outside of society. Dimsdale figures out how he could become more useful to society and improves his moral worth. That concludes our analysis of Hester and Dimsdale through the lens of utilitarianism. Thanks for watching! That concludes our analysis of Hester and Dimmesdale through the lens of utilitarianism. Thanks for watching!